Let's turn now to international headlines. President Trump says he's working to re-establish a U.S. presence at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, 4 years after America's chaotic withdrawal left the facility in Taliban hands. The president floated the idea during the joint press conference with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Wrapping up his state visit to the UK, he linked the move to countering China's growing influence in the region. Joining us now is former Marine intelligence officer and host of the Strap podcast, who has worked closely with U.S. forces operating in and out of Bagram in the past. Let's start with the basics. Why is Bagram Air Base so important, and why would the U.S. want it back? Bagram was the major U.S. hub in Afghanistan, strategically located near Kabul, about 20 miles away. It was the main logistical center for moving personnel and supplies. Because Afghanistan is landlocked, access routes were always complicated. You either brought material up through Pakistan, where the roads were controlled by unfriendly militias, or down from the north, which was just as difficult. That made Bagram essential. Everything flowed through there: equipment, intelligence, operations. It was the heartbeat of U.S. presence in the country. President Trump was very critical of how the U.S. pulled out of Bagram before completing the full withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's argued that leaving the base early made the final exit far more chaotic than it needed to be. Do we know what's been happening at Bagram since then? Yes, reports suggest the Taliban have been using it actively, and, more significantly, that China has been flying personnel and equipment in and out. Beijing is believed to be eyeing Afghanistan's vast reserves of rare earth minerals, worth an estimated $1 trillion. That's one of the main concerns for Washington, both economically and strategically. Countering China's footprint in Afghanistan appears to be a major driver behind this push to re-establish a U.S. foothold at Bagram. Would that mean the U.S. would have to negotiate directly with the Taliban to make this happen? Almost certainly. The Taliban is the governing authority, whether we recognize them or not. Any U.S. presence in Afghanistan would require some kind of agreement with them, because operating inside a country completely controlled by a hostile government is simply not feasible. But it would be politically and ideologically difficult for both sides. The Taliban's worldview is fundamentally opposed to America's values, and past relations have been openly hostile. Still, there may be pragmatic motivations on both ends, especially if the Taliban see some benefit in balancing Chinese influence. That sounds incredibly complicated, and potentially risky. Re-establishing operations at Bagram would be a massive undertaking. The base would need to be inspected for safety, structural integrity, and possible sabotage. Security would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Even though the Taliban control the country, they don't control everything. Groups like ISIS-K are still active and hostile to both the Taliban and the U.S. Any American return would face multiple layers of threat. There are reports from the Associated Press that the Taliban is seeking to normalize ties with the U.S. after what's been called a geopolitical blackout, due largely to international outrage over human rights abuses. Can you elaborate on that? Yes, Afghanistan has been isolated since the Taliban takeover. Their record on human rights, particularly women's rights, has drawn global condemnation. Girls are barred from education, women are excluded from public life, and reports of torture and public executions persist. Their rule reflects an extreme interpretation of Islam, interwoven with long-standing tribal traditions. Afghanistan today is a far cry from what it was in the 1970s, before Soviet intervention, when it was relatively open and tolerant. That international isolation has created deep economic strain. The Taliban have limited access to foreign aid, and internal crises, like recent earthquakes, have exposed their government's inability to respond effectively. Those pressures may be pushing them to look for new diplomatic and economic openings, even with former enemies. So bottom line, what's the real motivation here? From Washington's perspective, countering China and re-establishing a strategic foothold in Central Asia. From the Taliban's perspective, gaining legitimacy, economic relief, and perhaps diversifying their international partnerships. Whether either side can trust the other enough to make that happen, that's another question entirely. A fascinating and complex situation. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights. My pleasure. Like the channel, comment, subscribe.